There were bright flashes of red in the sky. It's as if someone was waving around a flare light from space, faint but noticeable. We all made UFO jokes and laughed as we nailed our tents into the ground. I knew for sure that there were 5 of us. We have all been friends since early middle school and were celebrating our high school graduation with this getaway camping trip. The flashes of red must have stopped randomly as we made conversation while fixing up our tents. Dave managed to put his tent together the fastest and told us he was going to find some branches for the fire. I remember how he had worked with me at the local gas station last year. We used to do the night shift together, and it had made working at a desolate gas station much more fun than it was supposed to be. There was also Eric in the corner, still reading his tent manual, fidgeting with his signature round glasses. I wasn't as close with Eric as I was with the others, but I still remember sitting with him in math class and copying his homework one time. Ava was also there talking with Sally, my cousin. Both had decided to team up and work on one tent at a time. I also have clear memories of them, hanging around at school in our usual places. In fact, I even knew Ava's younger brother, as he used to beg to go with us wherever we went. I bring all this up because I'm sure that there were 5 of us, including me, and that I knew everyone in the group. So Dave had went to get some branches as we pulled out some foldable chairs and set them up around the fire pit. I remember feeling uneasy as the sun set and darkness began to consume the forest. The shadows of trees elongated around us as the minutes ticked by. Eric went to get a flashlight from his bag while we wondered what was taking Dave so long. He appeared soon after, the harsh rustling sounds of the bushes signifying his return. We were all buried in our chairs at this point, covered by our jackets. The temperature had dropped quickly, and a slight breeze was beginning to pick up. "Geez, you guys weren't even bothered to pull out a chair for me," Dave said, as he arranged all the branches in the pit. We had set up 5 chairs around the fire. I tried to rationalize the situation, but no matter how hard I focused, my head felt like it was underwater. I had perfect clarity up until that moment, but when I tried to focus on why 5 chairs were occupied when Dave hadn't sat down yet, my head seemed to just stop working, as if something was reaching in and pulling out my thoughts. Instinctually, I felt even more uneasy now, and I had placed why. The whole forest had gone dead silent. I looked around at the faces of the others and could tell that they had felt the same. Eric was fidgeting with his fingers, trying to scan around the group and spot the extra person, but it was futile. I scanned every face, each etched in worry and frowning in frustration, except for, "It's all right, I'll get the chair myself," Dave said, breaking the silence and somewhat alleviating the tension. I got up and offered to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We headed away from the fire pit towards the tents, but I kept my eyes glued on our group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Dave as he looked around, and realized that we had indeed only packed 5 chairs. In fact, every person had brought with them their own chair. They were heavy to carry, and we wouldn't bring any extra needlessly. "There's 5, right? I mean, there's 5 chairs," Dave replied. His voice wavered as he spoke. "No, I just think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said. My mind was struggling to address the issue head-on, and now sought to find rational excuses instead. I didn't quite feel in control of my thoughts. It felt like swimming in a dream, and if I tried to force myself to think about who the 6th person was, my head would begin to throb. "Yeah, that sounds about right, actually," Dave said, relaxing and heading back to the group. When we walked back to the fire pit and circle of chairs, 2 chairs were empty, one for me and one for Dave. Everything was adding up now, even though we all agreed it wasn't before. Sally suggested we were all probably tired after the long hike to get here, and probably just needed some sleep. She could have been right. We were all sleep deprived from waking up very early today to make it on time. Ava brought out the drinks. The whole six-pack was emptied. We all moved closer to the crackling fire for warmth as we took sips from our cans and reminisced on memories of last year. Ava was in the middle of telling us about that one time she was home alone with weird things happening in her house when I got these sudden chills despite the pleasant warmth of the fire. What felt cozy and safe moments ago felt wrong now, all because I realized that there was a crucial detail I missed. "Who started the fire?" I asked, completely interrupting Ava in the middle of her story and breaking everyone else's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again I scanned the faces staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the light from the fire, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Dave?" Eric asked. Dave shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jenny did it," Sally said, looking over at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except for the encompassing darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees behind me made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. "Wait, I don't know," Sally said. Her eyes had gone wide and she was shaking visibly. She continued to look around frantically as Ava moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. "I think we should leave this place," Ava stuttered. "Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it," Dave said. "But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave now," someone else said. "Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow," Eric agreed. I tried to protest, but realized Eric was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness within which navigation would be near impossible. "Let's not sleep in our separate tents just to be safe," Sally said. We all agreed. We only brought one-person tents with us, but we could squeeze two if we tried. That way no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Dave and Sally, like always went with Ava. Eric kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point we all realized that there were only 5 of us, and suddenly we were all huddling up in the middle of the clearing. "Why do we keep thinking there are 6 of us here?" Eric asked. Sweat was dripping down his face, despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone on his own, under the assumption that there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. "There's me, Dave, Eric, Ava, Sally, and..." I was pointing at each of them as I said the name. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Sally. The left side of my head felt like there was a knife stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Dave held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Dave helped me into a tent, while the 4 outside discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain beating against my skull came and went in waves. Sally had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together, so their openings faced together at right angles in a sort of U shape, so we could sleep as close as possible, and also limit the entrance to our tents. Dave was about to go to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 5 of us. Eric would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he was more comfortable with it, since all the tents were very close now. Looking back now, I think He was just trying to put a brave face on for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated in our group and knew that none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose in the morning. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up, and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was just pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, with the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing. I turned my head to look over at the two tents we had left out, and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Ava's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Dave and I ripped our tent door open to find Sally and Ava looking into Eric's tent. We pushed them aside. Eric's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body rolled around it with the blue fabric, now dripping with dark blood. Dave zipped up the door of the tent. Ava was in shock. Her eyes had become glassy and unfocused. Sally was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Dave picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The five of us huddled together, Dave leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to help us get through this 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Ava tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it, so we could keep going. They dragged her into the woods instead. It happened too quickly for any of us to process. Sally was about to run after Ava when Dave held her back. She struggled and managed to free herself, running into the trees to follow the echoes of Ava's screams. I was about to run after her, but Dave held me by the shoulders and shook me hard. "We need to get out of here, Jenny. Please," he said. I hesitated but jolted into motion again when Sally's voice was cut off abruptly. She had been calling out Ava's name as she ran after her. Dave and I continued to run down the trail, trying to get to our car so we could get out of here. There was nothing we could do. At some point, there were 3 of us running on the trail. Dave and I shoulder to shoulder, while someone followed us closely behind. "Dave, who's behind us?" I gasped. My heart was threatening to burst through my ribcage, and my legs burned. He turned to look at me. Confusion transformed into fear on his face, and then into rage. "You keep running," he told me, as he produced a pocket knife from his pants. He handed me the car keys, which I nearly dropped. Then he turned around suddenly and jumped at whoever was behind us. I continued to run in fear as the sounds of a struggle grew behind me. I tripped and tumbled through the trail for what felt like hours. I didn't allow myself to stop. I almost cried when the trail ended, and I walked out into the familiar car park. Not wasting a second, I ran to the car and started it up, accelerating out of that forest and onto the highway within mere seconds. I'm typing this post out at a rest stop. My phone has finally regained service, and I've called 911 to try and explain the situation. I don't think they believe my version of events, but they sent a car my way, regardless. As I wait, the sun is finally starting to rise. After I hit the post button on this, I'm going to check why the person in my back seat has been so silent the whole time. To be honest, it was all about delay. Maura was going to Rhode Island School of Design. There had never been any question of that. Goody still wasn't sure he wanted to go to University of Boston, but he was. Arnie was going to MIT, and I was taking my gap year. As my mother put it, you could do anything you want to. Because I was a musician, a math whiz, a creative vlogger, and a nice guy who could be a therapist just like his parents. Of course, the one thing I couldn't do was get admitted to STI, which meant things were over with Maura, pretty much. I'd have held out more hope if I hadn't heard the relief in her voice when I told her about my rejection. So we went camping, our last outing as a gang. At the end of August, we'd go our separate ways. Goody and Arnie would stay in touch, but Maura would be sleeping with some upperclassman already pulling shows in the East Village, and I'd be working at McDonald's, still trying to figure my shit out. We deserve this memory, I told them. Eventually I got everyone on board. The gang usually does what I want. Whether that's acting in my latest video, or going to a Ren fair, or marching with Black Lives Matter, or whatever. They always do what I want, even though I'm the one who doesn't know what he wants. The campsite I picked out was the most remote one I could find, keeping in mind that we were in the Northeast, where the white man has been building roads for over 300 years. It was in a state park near the Canadian border, near a town with the fabulous name of Nowhere, Vermont. It sounded like Odysseus dodging tourists rather than Cyclops. Where did you go last summer? Nowhere. Had a great time. I like staying home sometimes too. The plan was to rent 2 canoes, paddle the length of a 2-mile lake, portage 500 feet around a bog, then cross another twisty lake to a remote lean-to, miles from the nearest road. We got a late start as usual, because Arnie was sure there was a more efficient way to pack everything. "Tell me that isn't better," he said when we finally took off. With a good 6 inches of visibility out the rear window. Then we were delayed because we had to stop at a local diner rather than fast food for lunch. This was Maura's obsession. "The journey is the adventure," she said for the 14th time. "Yeah, but..." Across the counter, the cook was making a ham sandwich, which involved carefully removing a hunk of ham from the cooler, selecting a knife, honing the edge, and meticulously cutting a 1/4-inch slice of ham. I dropped my voice. "At this rate, the journey is going to be the entire adventure. You're hopeless." I have to admit, it was probably the best ham sandwich I ever had, but it meant we didn't get to the park until after 6. "It's kind of late to set out for the remote site now," the ranger told us. "We're good," I assured him. I'd be damned if we'd spend a night in a motel or something. Sunset isn't until, 8 up here? 7:56, but it'll be dark under the trees before then. "We have headlamps," I said. "You need to be in camp before dark," the ranger insisted. "We've got a problem bear here." There was a little pause before he said, "Bear," so small I wasn't sure if it was my imagination. "Well then, get us the paddles and we'll be off. Cheese and crackers, there's no talking you out of this." Yes, he really said cheese and crackers. He was a roly-poly, balding ranger who could almost get away with it. "Well, couple things you need to know. The best way to keep the bear out is there's a rope in the lean-to tied with some iron spikes. String that around your camp. It'll keep him out." "Seriously? A rope to keep out a bear?" I said. "It's the iron spikes," the ranger said. "He doesn't like the noise." "Sure," Maura said. "It'll keep out fairies too." The ranger glanced at Goody and Arnie. "Cheese and crackers, that's no business of mine." "She means elves," I said. The ranger just shook his head, as if it were beyond him to try to understand city people. "Just put up the rope, for the bear. Also make sure you use the portage trail between the lakes. It looks like you could take a shortcut through the bog, but a lot of what looks like ground there isn't. Just a layer of peat floating on water and muck. Couple of folks have gotten stuck, and one we couldn't get out in time. Don't mean to scare you. But portage, trail, rope around your sight. You'll have a good time." By the time we had the paddles and loaded up, it was 6:45. Arnie had to make sure that the loads were properly and evenly distributed, and for once I appreciated his precision. Since we were all underage, we didn't want to take a chance of having to buy more alcohol far from home. So we had coolers loaded with 4 cases of beer, 2 jugs of whiskey, not to mention 6 days' worth of groceries. As it was, the canoes floated barely 6 inches between water and rail and handled like battleships. I'd hate to try them unbalanced. But it meant the sun was already near the horizon when we made it across the first lake. "Okay, we've got to do this systematically," Arnie said as soon as we beached. "Work from the front of the canoe to the back. Pile everything on the bank in a line, not a heap. Then once we get the canoes over, it'll go right back in." We ran the goods up the trail, but of course Goody didn't keep them in line. In case you're wondering, his real name is Ben, but Arnie got so tired of him saying, "It's good enough." One day he declared, "That's your new name, good enough." And it was, until it got shortened to Goody or just Goody. Their interpersonal dynamic cost us another 15 minutes, reloading everything, made longer by Arnie's complaining about his sloppiness and Mora's complaining about his complaining. All this rushing is making the journey really unpleasant. The bear isn't going to be punching a clock. Can't we appreciate the process? "I'll appreciate the process a lot more once we've got where we're going," Goody said. "Forgive me if I don't want to search the woods in the dark for a lean-to, while simultaneously dodging bears. I'm not seriously worried about a bear," I said. "But I definitely do want to find our camp before it gets too dark to see." The canoes were just as heavy on the second lake. We shoved them through the water while the sky faded from red to cool gray, and the surrounding trees from green to black. Goody leapt from his boat the moment it scraped on land and ran up into the woods. I wanted to dash after him, but I forced myself to be cool and wait for Mora to get out, haul the canoe up on the rocks and brace it for me to climb out. I picked up my duffel. Already the darkness under the trees was thick, but I made out Goody easily, especially because he was clanking like a knight in armor. He made it almost to the landing, dragging a rope behind him. "This will lead you right to it," he said. "Then we can close it around the camp when we're done. Let's go." We started hauling our gear up, except Mora, who had to go and see the camp first. Mora could not be rushed into anything, one of the first signs of trouble in our relationship. At any rate, camp was a mossy lean-to, just far enough into the woods to be invisible from the lake, but not so far you couldn't see water through the trees. We hauled everything easily enough. We were down to 2 little day packs and a cooler full of beer. Mora and I went back for them. I figured she could take the day packs and I could haul the cooler, but she just picked up 1 day pack and was off. I almost left the other day pack for a second trip when I heard a splash, a big splash. The lake had a squiggly W shape, so I couldn't see the far end, but somewhere something big had landed in the water. I slung the day pack on my back, picked up the cooler, and legged it up to the camp. "The bear's on its way," I announced. "Grab the rope," Goody said. "Wrap it around the camp." Arnie was building the fire. Mora was making sure everything was arranged with proper feng shui or something. I went back for the rope. There was something in the lake, all right. A dark smudge that hadn't been there before. It was moving, broad, black, and hairy. The back of a bear. Just breaking the surface. It was moving pretty quickly straight toward us. "This is New England, not the Rocky Mountains. We have black bears, not grizzlies. Black bears can kill you without a thought, but they don't hunt you. As long as you keep your distance, let the bear do whatever it wants and stay away from the cubs. They aren't really dangerous, but there was something about the sight of that broad hairy back coming straight for me that I didn't like. I found the end of the rope and hurried back to camp, looping it up as I went. The spikes were tied in every 10 feet or so, 3 of them tied together to make a loose, clangy iron triangle. There was something wrong about that bear, I thought, as I played out the rope around camp, looping it over low branches and around saplings. Suddenly it hit me, just as I reached the end of the rope, and discovered I'd tried to surround too big a camp and couldn't close the cordon. Wouldn't a bear swim with its head above water? I considered my incomplete cordon. No rope would stop a bear that wanted to get in. Hell, it wouldn't even delay a bear. He'd walk right through as if it weren't there. The rope was simply symbolic. Touch the rope and there's a clangy noise. As such, it wouldn't matter that there was a 10-foot gap in the rope, I didn't think. Not to a bear. Bears don't swim underwater for 100 yards. Bears don't, I didn't think, swim quite that fast. I hurried back, unwrapped the saplings, circled halfway around the camp so I could cut 5 feet off the diameter. I just started back around when something moved down at the lake. It was too dark to see anything under the trees, but the lake still reflected sky glow. The lake was bright gray between the black trunks of trees. The shadow that passed briefly between wood and water was definitely bear-shaped, either that or a fat human. It stood erect, then shifted to the side, so I couldn't see it, except as flashes of movement. I stopped watching and started stretching the rope around camp. "Incoming," I called. "Hurry, hurry," Goody said. "We should make some noise," Arnie said. "Bears don't like noise." Funny how it is that when told to make noise, everybody falls silent, trying to figure out what to say. Meanwhile, there I was, on the outer edge, listening to the crash of something big getting closer through the woods. "I'm making noise," I said loudly. "Noise, noise, noise. I'm a loud, scary noise maker." Goody took up the song. "I'm even noisier. Noisy noise. I'm the noisiest noisy noise in Noiseland." I reached the starting end of the rope, joined them with a quick square knot, and retreated to the fire. We abandoned even our lame efforts at noise-making as we all strained to hear the dark. The shadows were silent, no birds, no crickets, just the wind in the trees. "I guess it wandered off," I said. A single metallic clank sounded somewhere between us and the lake. We listened intently. A double clank. A little to the left, another, further around. We didn't hear anything passing through the brush. We didn't see a shadow move. One by one, the iron triangles clanked, now passing behind the lean-to, emerging on the other side, passing around back to the beginning. We held our breath. Suddenly, every triangle around the camp rattled at once. Mora picked up the cast-iron Dutch oven and clanged the lid against it. Shouting deep and fierce, we all joined in, shrieking at the top of our lungs. Silence, silence, and stillness. Then we heard a scraping sound, further away, the sound of metal on stone. "The canoes," Goody said. "It's going after the canoes. We'll be trapped." "It's a bear," Arnie said. "It doesn't know it can do that." "Bears are a lot smarter than we think," Mora said. A loud metallic crunch seemed to side with Mora, then more scraping and a large splash. "Even if he does sink the canoes," I said, "we can walk out. It'll be 5-6 miles of bushwhacking, but it's perfectly doable, just a day hike." The noises had no answer to that. After a moment we heard a bird call, a soft screech. Then the cricket started. "Well, that was exciting," said Arnie. "Should we get supper on?" "We'd need to gather more wood for the fire," Goody said. We all considered wandering around in the dark outside our fairy perimeter. "We could cook the burgers on the camp stove," Goody said. "No way," Mora said. "That's the only fresh food we brought. I'm not ruining our only cookout. Let's break out the macaroni. We'd need to go to the lake for water, I said. That sounded even scarier. The chili then, Goody said. So we ate canned chili and drank our ration of 2 beers, and then another, because the fire had gone out and we couldn't make s'mores, then maybe a little whiskey, because it was the first night, because we'd been scared. No one looked at their watch when we went to bed. It was one of our rules when camping. No phones, no internet, no watches. But it was really late. If you've never slept in a lean-to, you've missed something. Closed in on 3 sides, wide open on the 4th, with a huge overhang. They are dry in all but the most violent storms, but there's nothing, not even a screen, between you and the night. Usually I loved them, but that night I'd have been happier of something, even 0.5 millimeter of rip-stop nylon surrounding me. In the morning, all our fear of monstrous bears had melted away. We had only to contend with the hassle of mild hangovers and the canoes. One had a big dent in the side. The other was floating upside down in the middle of the lake. Arnie quickly hammered out the dent with a large rock. It wouldn't win any beauty prizes, but it was roughly canoe-shaped. Then he and I paddled out to the other. It was largely undamaged once it was hauled out of the water and put back right side up. We weren't sure if it had had those 4 long scratch marks before. By the time we got back to camp, Goody and Maura had gathered enough firewood for the remaining 6 days, so all the trauma of the night had been solved, and we could laugh at how scared we had gotten over a stupid bear who was, we avowed religiously, more afraid of us than we were of him. Maura had found a curious burl of wood she'd started carving, and Goody was journaling, so I went back on the lake and caught a small perch. It wasn't enough to make dinner with, so we stuck it on ice in the cooler and cooked our burgers. By the time night fell, we were encamped and ready. We'd even hauled the canoes up into our enclosure, just for safekeeping, but night fell, and with it, nothing. We convinced ourselves we'd just scared ourselves stupid, and this time got a good night's sleep. The next day I felt a compulsion to catch enough fish to go with the one I caught yesterday. The others climbed a nearby mountain, while I brought in 3 more perch, which gave us a big fish dinner. The fear of the first night was forgotten. The last day of our trip, we decided to go to the bog at the far side of the lake. We weren't going to try to cross it, of course, but there were a lot of cool plants that grew in bogs. All the carnivorous plants, like sundews and pitcher plants and Venus flytraps, and orchids like pink ladies' slippers that bloomed once in 4 years. Not to mention crossbills, flycatchers, and red-capped warblers. We negotiated a winding path as far into the bog as our canoes could take us. Finally, we reached a limit in 2 inches of the tea-colored water between mushy banks. We found a lot of sundew along the edge, and a couple of pitcher plants, the deadly cone-shaped leaves lying in splayed whorls, looking stomped on and innocent. Then Maura spied a dash of pink, 10 yards inland, and had to get out of the boat. "Remember what the ranger said," Goody warned. "I'll check my footing," she promised. "Worst that can happen, I get stuck in the mud and lose a shoe, right?" Then, before anyone could stop her, she was out of the canoe and, one careful step at a time, making her way toward the pink. "Oh, wow," she said. So I climbed out too. The ground felt spongy and uncertain underfoot. I tested my weight with each step. Though I was never completely sure it would hold me, I made it. There was the orchid, a single blossom, bright pink on a thin green stalk. It didn't quite look like a silk lady's slipper. Not unless she wore a quadruple E. "Isn't it marvelous?" Maura said. Yes, I suppose it was. I took a step closer, and my foot went through the moss, halfway to my knee. "Dang," I said, and pulled but it didn't come free. I pulled again. "I'm stuck," I said with a laugh. It felt like something had caught around my ankle. "Do you need a hand?" Maura asked. "Something." She came over and I put my hands on her shoulder and pulled. I was held tight. "I think I'm caught under some root or something," I said. "Let me—" I tried angling my foot one way, then the other. Whatever I had caught on had looped tight around my ankle. I couldn't help imagining that I was held. "Do you need help?" Arnie asked. "I'm tangled on something," I said. "Either that or the bog monsters got me." I said it to be a joke, then wished I hadn't. "You need my knife?" Arnie asked. "Good idea," I said. "I've got mine." I unfolded my lock blade and tried to dig through the peat. It was weird. The ground was so matted it really resisted digging. I tried instead to cut out a square, and that went easily. No sooner had I pried a block out than I felt a tug on my ankle and sank 2 inches deeper. "Hey!" I just reacted. Really. The ground was pulling me, so I stabbed the ground, shoved the blade deep in right next to my foot. My ankle released, so suddenly I fell over backwards and dropped my knife. I was soaking wet. My knife had vanished too, probably sunk just an inch deep in the brown water, but no way to know where. Losing my knife irritated me, and with the soaking in bog water, my interest in rare orchids was seriously curtailed. This annoyed Maura no end. "You know how you say the journey is half the adventure?" I asked. "Well, now the journey kind of sucks. For you, maybe. It's always about you, isn't it?" Seemed to me it was always about how it wasn't about me, but there wasn't any point in arguing anymore. We were over. We were just waiting for circumstances to separate us, so we wouldn't have to dig up the courage to say so. As we paddled back to camp, I couldn't help but think about how much it had felt like something had held my ankle and pulled and let go when I stabbed. Steel knife. Steel is, of course, just a specially treated iron. Very different sheer strength, much more able to hold a sharp edge, but it's still the element fey. If iron burns, so does steel. Just to finish the mood, it began to rain. Nothing serious, just a steady patter that meant sitting around the campfire was not going to happen. I changed clothes, Goody strung the perimeter rope, and Arnie cooked up the last of the mackey cheese. We were out of beer, because of course we hadn't kept to our 2-a-night ration, so we sat in the lean-to, drank the last of the whiskey, and thought maudlin thoughts about not seeing each other again. Night fell, but no one wanted to go to bed, because once we went to bed, there'd be nothing left but going home and going our separate ways. "I'm going to miss being able to get out in the woods like this," Maura said. "I mean, just listen to the night. There's not a sound of civilization anywhere." We listened. She was right. There was no traffic, no refrigerator hum, no HVAC. The rain had eased up, just a soft pitter of drops off the trees. No birds, no crickets. Pit, pit, pitter-pat. Silence in between. "We did string the rope around camp, didn't we?" I asked. "I did," Goody said. "It's fine." We listened. Silence between the raindrops. One of the iron triangles on the lakeside clanged. "That was just the wind," Goody said. But it was obvious he was trying to persuade himself. "There isn't any wind," Arnie said. Another clanged, then another, once again circling the camp. It went all the way around behind the lean-to, then it stopped. We listened, willing the triangles to continue the clang around camp. Silence. "Goody," I said slowly. "When you put the rope around camp, did you tie the 2 ends together?" "I tied it to the nail on the side of the lean-to," Goody said defensively. "The same nail?" I asked. "Both ends to the same nail." "No, one on one side, the other on the other. It's good enough. We heard a faint scratching noise from the roof. All eyes looked up, as if we might be able to see through the ceiling. We should make some noise, Mora whispered. A soft, muddy voice answered her from up above. I'm a loud, scary noisemaker. That's no fucking bear, Mora exclaimed, and jumped out of the lean-to, ready to give a thorough tongue-lashing to whoever was trying to scare us. A swollen, livid arm shot down and grabbed a fistful of blonde curls, lifting her kicking off the ground. I jumped out, snagged the Dutch oven, and swung it in a long-armed arc, connecting meatily with the thing's forearm. It dropped her in a howl of rage. Run, I shouted. Run for the canoes. Arnie and Goody took off like a bullet. Mora picked herself up and scampered after them. My headlamp illuminated a huge shape on the lean-to roof, a bulbous head and a vaguely human mouth, except the lips made a neat sucker-like oval, and it was several times too large. The shape quivered, like a cat ready to pounce. I hurled the Dutch oven at its sucker and bolted before I saw if I hit or not. Goody and Arnie were turning their boat around. Mora was kneeling backwards in the stern of ours, paddling backwards. I had to run out into the lake to leap aboard. We didn't waste any time turning, but just paddled like crazy. We were 100 yards offshore before we heard the splash of it hitting the lake. Goody and Arnie were 2 or 3 lengths behind, but catching up quickly. I remembered how fast the thing had come at us the first night. There was no way we could outrun it, not over a mile of lake. We were rounding the first bend when I saw a shimmer in the water behind us. A faint V pointed right between us. Goody and Arnie were just overtaking. The V drew closer, then with a sudden flip of hairy back it vanished. The thing had dived down to the bottom. The next time we saw it, it would be right alongside. Iron! We needed iron, but I'd lost my knife in the bog, and the damn canoes were made of aluminum. Incoming! I shouted. A second later, 2 mottled arms shot up on either side of Goody and Arnie's boat. The boat crumpled between them, folding in half and going straight down, middle first. Mora and I paddled like crazy. There was some splashing behind us, but I didn't look back. Then the splashing stopped. Either it was feasting on their bones or saving them for later and coming after us. I kept my eyes on the portageway. If we could just make the portageway, we'd be out of this hellhole. The monster couldn't follow on the other lake, I was sure. I looked back. The V in the water was making straight for us, coming fast, but we were going to make it. Mora, I shouted. When we hit ground, don't wait for me. Just run. The canoe scraped on gravel. Mora jumped out so fast the canoe had no time to rock. I jumped out, whipped it up onto my shoulders like some epic pioneer, and ran the 500-foot portageway. My lungs were burning for air, but I kept running anyway. Up ahead, Mora was waiting for me, right at the edge of the bogland. I wanted to shout at her, "Swim out into the lake, get away!" But I had no air to shout. I wanted to wave her ahead, but my hands were full of canoe. "Hurry!" she shouted, as if I could have run any faster. At first it looked like a wave of mud rising toward her in slow-motion horror. Then it sprouted those swollen arms, and the leering, bulbous head. It enveloped her. I ran right past, threw the canoe on the water, and threw myself in the canoe. The force of my panic carried me 100 feet from shore before I could pick up my paddle and start the 2-mile trip across the Black Lake. Nothing pursued me. Of course, I pounded on the ranger's cabin until he got up. I told him he had to go help my friends, but he just said, "Cheese and crackers, not in the middle of the night," he called the sheriff. It took the sheriff 45 minutes to get there. By that time, I had been able to think about what to tell him, and decided bog monster was probably best. He'd assume I was scared of shadows, but it would mean whatever evidence he found, whether it looked more human or bear, wouldn't contradict what I'd said. He went out on the lake and shone a powerful light all around the bog area, but didn't cross the portage way until after sunrise. In the morning, they retrieved the canoe, but no bodies. The canoe had been folded so efficiently, the bow and stern nearly touched. The sheriff concluded that Goody and Arnie had been trapped in the crumpled metal and drowned. The bear just spooned them out like two halves of an avocado. Bones are probably buried in the silt at the bottom of the lake. But they know there is something unnatural in that bog. They know, and they let us go there. I know they know, because they retrieved our gear, including our Dutch oven, and our Dutch oven had a smear of blood on it. They said they sent it to the lab to be tested, but they never said whether it was bear or human blood. They never said anything at all. When I called a month later, they couldn't find any record of having taken our Dutch oven at all. I need to get this information off my chest. I'm writing this on the shoulder of the highway in Utah. It's 4 a.m., and I've been driving non-stop for almost 2 hours. I don't know if you've ever been to Utah, but it gets pitch black at night. Nothing exists beyond the high beams of my car. Well, at least from what I can perceive. I know something is out there, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I was backpacking through Zion National Park, this fantastic place, where the canyon walls are a deep sunset red and pine trees grow straight out of the rocks. Even in my delirium, I can still appreciate the beauty of it. My trip wasn't anything serious, just a 3-day turnaround trip, spanning about 30 miles in total. I don't see that many people around this time of year, aside from the occasional day hiker. Most tend to stay out during the winter due to cold weather, snow, and the risk of flash floods brought on from the rainy season. I, however, thrive in isolation. The fewer people around make it easier for me to appreciate the park and all its natural beauty. For the uninitiated, backpacking is a challenging activity that most people don't dare to try, which is unfortunate. I feel like people come the most alive when they push themselves to do these kinds of things. And as cheesy as it sounds, you really do experience some magic when you're this far removed from the city and our modern luxuries. I could go on about the ecosystems that have never encountered human contact and how it feels to step into a truly wild world. But I'd be talking out of my arse, because after today, I realized I genuinely have no idea of what lives in those woods, or any area not lived in by people. It was my second night. After 2 long days of walking in a straight line and slowly pacing myself and exploring, I set up my tent and got ready to hurry back to my car. As much as I love the outdoors, nothing can compete with the sensation of hot, fast food after several days of roughing it. As I ate my military rations, I was already imagining the cheeseburgers I'd be eating the following day. Over the last 2 days, I walked about 15 miles into the park, covering about 7 miles a day with my heavy bag. I'll be the first to tell you how important it is not to overpack for trips like these. Every pound makes a difference when you're carrying it through the brush. Even short excursions can be challenging if your bag is too heavy. Fortunately, I learned from my previous trips and kept my pack to around 35 pounds. After my meal of powdered lasagna and a candy bar was finished, I poked at the hot coals in my makeshift fire pit. I also packed a camp stove to cook with, but when you go camping, you have to make a campfire. It's an unofficial rule that everyone follows. There's something about being in the wilderness at night that triggers a subconscious instinct in us to build a fire and illuminate the dark. Our ancestors used this instinct daily to survive, and it became embedded in our DNA. Tonight, this instinct kept me alive. As my fire began to shrink, my desire for sleep began to increase. When you're in the woods with no technology, the oppressive darkness brought on by night naturally makes you drowsy. I was getting ready to stand up and put out my fire when I suddenly noticed the sensation that I was being watched. The feeling washed over me, and after identifying it, I realized there were no sounds in the woods around me. Even in winter, you can hear noises from the non-hibernating critters. But all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees above me, and see the gaps between branches, barely illuminated by the light of a crescent moon. At the time, it felt like a better idea to build my fire back up. I could always put it out later after all, and this was my last night in the woods, so I could spare using extra materials. As I put my remaining wood in the fire, I thought I heard something in the tree line. I had set up my tent in a small clearing, no larger than 15 feet. It was just big enough for me to put my tent in the center and have about 10 feet on all sides. So whatever I was hearing was incredibly close to me. And even with my medium-sized campfire, I couldn't see anything outside of the clearing. A couple of times I heard rustling in the leaves, and I shined my spotlight in the direction of the noise. But all I would ever see were the same piles of dead leaves that cover the forest floor everywhere else in the winter. I didn't smell blood or rot or anything you usually read about in ghost stories. I genuinely had no idea at all what was moving around my camp, and I think that was more unnerving. I just know that something was circling my shelter, but wouldn't walk into the clearing. This isn't entirely unexpected. After all, Zion is home to many different species of animals, including coyotes, foxes, and mountain lions. My worst fear at this moment would be to have a cougar in my camp, not the fun kind in this case. I sat back in front of the fire after patrolling my site's perimeter and found a red flower right in front of where I sat before. Now I know this may seem insignificant to the uninitiated, but finding a flower like this in the middle of January was entirely out of place. And stranger still, I had no memory of seeing this flower from the previous 3 hours of sitting by the fire. I studied it closely, noting that it was indeed rooted to the earth. It hadn't been placed on the ground. It must have already been here, and I just didn't notice. I picked it and realized I didn't recognize the species. I'm no expert on the flora and fauna of Zion, but I haven't seen a plant like this anywhere before. I washed out the bag my MRE came in and placed the flower inside to take home and look up on the internet. I was sure someone on Reddit would be able to identify it. With no other oddities, I eventually gave in to my exhaustion and went to sleep. I know you're not supposed to, but I let my fire burn out on its own. It was low enough I didn't think it would be a hazard, but the soft glow gave me a feeling of security to sleep. I must have been asleep for about an hour before I woke up to the feeling of something large moving under my tent. The best way I can describe it is to imagine if a large snake slithered under your sheets in bed. As you laid down on top of it, it was so unnatural. I shot up awake immediately and, still trapped in my sleeping bag, fell over in the process of my escape. Turning on my light and aiming it at the floor revealed that something was moving under the thin material of my tent's floor, inspecting the warm spot where I was sleeping. My mind was racing as I began to theorize what it could possibly be. Maybe it was a skunk that was getting too nosy for its own good, or maybe it really was a snake, but I couldn't think of a species of snake in Utah that could be thicker than my arm. Also, again, snakes aren't usually active in the middle of winter, especially in the dark of night. The fear of the unknown propelled me out of my tent, with just enough clarity for me to grab my bag and step into the clearing. I can't begin to describe the feeling of confusion and dread that overcame me when I saw a ring of those damn red flowers completely circled around my tent. They were all planted in the ground the same as the first, but forming a perfect circle that nature could not produce so accurately by itself. Without any warning, I heard the sound of fabric tearing apart, followed by the sounds of something desperately clawing at my tent, and what I can only describe as a low, bassy groaning. It didn't sound natural. It sounded more like a low frequency. You'd hear if you turned the bass on your car all the way up and amplified that several times. It was more than just a sound. It reverberated in my insides and made me feel nauseous. Then, illuminated by my spotlight, I saw a massive arm shoot out from the top of my tent, an inhuman appendage with odd-numbered digits and skin that more resembles tree bark than flesh. The demon limb pulled my entire tent under the earth in one swift move, leaving behind a crumbled mess of dirt, but leaving the flowers undisturbed. I was shocked. I couldn't move. Hell, I couldn't even process what happened. Nothing in my wildest dreams could prepare me for what I could only describe as a shark pulling my shelter under the compact soil like it was water. I stood there for what felt like hours, but in reality was only a few moments. I felt that frequency again, from below the earth. It sounded frustrated, like it didn't get what it was after. I finally found my courage and ran from that spot. I lost some supplies that I had left inside my tent and around my campsite, but I couldn't care less at the moment. I just ran through the brush with my light trembling in my hand. I was constantly bumping into trees and grazing my legs on the thorny bushes, but the only thing on my mind was survival. Fight or flight is another instinct we inherit from our ancestors, the primal knowledge when we know we're up against something out of our league. I continued to hear the shifting of leaves behind me, but no matter where I shined my light, I saw nothing chasing me. I would gladly take a cougar at this point. At least I could have identified the threat and could know how to handle it. Then, at the last moment, I caught a glimpse of another one of those damn red flowers right in the middle of my path. I barely noticed it before I stepped on it by accident. As I said, it was right smack dab in my path, almost deliberately placed. The second my foot came into contact with it, I felt the earth shift under my weight. I lost my balance and fell face first onto the ground. I broke my nose in the process, but I didn't get the chance to appreciate the pain before that same arm wrapped its fingers around my boot. I don't think fingers is an accurate description. They were more like roots from a tree, long and gnarled and extending across my foot and up my leg. I released my boot from myself and propelled myself away from the crater. The arm whipped back into the ground, taking its prized boot under the dirt with it. Despite the discomfort of only wearing one boot, I continued to run, bloodying my unprotected foot, but not caring about the pain. Survival was the only thing on my mind. I started throwing things out of my pack to make travel a little easier. I had dropped about 10 pounds of gear when I found the bag with the red flower in it. I remembered how the thing attacked me when I stepped on the red flower. Was this thing tracking me because I took the flower? My curiosity wasn't worth being pulled beneath the earth. I took the flower out of the bag and threw it behind me in the direction of the noise of churning dirt. Before it even hit the ground, the same arm shot out of the dirt and caught it. To my surprise, it caught the flower with a tender open palm, not crushing the flower. A second arm emerged from the dirt, followed then by a third, and a fourth until there were more arms to count in the darkness. Then, what I perceived to be the creature's head rose from the center. I say perceived, because it didn't have a face, or anything I would recognize as a face. But it was in the center of its bulky mass, and the hand with the flower was raised in front of it. In complete contrast to its behavior up until now, it delicately nurtured the flower, applying some kind of ointment to the bottom of the stem where I had cut it out, and planting it in the ground. Its low frequency now resembled the cooing of a mourning dove, still as deep as before, but anger replaced by something else. At this point, I began to back away from this creature. I stepped on a dead tree branch, and it snapped its head in my direction, but turned back to its precious flower. I ran for hours until I reached my car. I'd never been so relieved to find my beat-up pickup in my life. As I pulled out of the woods and onto the main park road, I noticed a couple of red flowers along the side of the road. I made note to steer clear of them. I now know what happens if you mess with this creature's prized flowers. Looking at the clock, it was 2 a.m. The sun must have set around 5 p.m. the day before. I had covered 15 miles on foot in that time, and I was still on edge. The ranger station was closed for the night. The lights of the building turned off as I sped by. I stopped my car because my engine is running hot after pushing it so hard for the last couple of hours. I'm taking a break from camping for now. I love the outdoors, but seriously need to reconsider what threats live just out of sight of man. I'm not entirely sure what I saw tonight, but if you go camping, do not take anything that doesn't belong to you, and always listen to your instincts. Mine kept me alive today. We have them for a reason.